Gun rights versus gun control. It's a tightrope the legislature attempts to walk each year, and this year is no different, as questions persist over when and where it should be legal to carry guns. We're on the story. Welcome to On the Story, Lawmakers Edition. It's Wednesday, January 22nd, Day 7 of the 2014 legislative session. I'm Bobby Batista. Tonight, we're talking gun rights in Georgia, specifically when and where it's legal to carry them. We'll also dig into gun culture and the South. Do latitudes really affect attitudes? Well, it's often been said that you should never bring up religion or politics in polite company. But if you really want to stir things up, just mention guns. The Second Amendment is one of the most contentious and confounding portions of the U.S. Constitution. Does the fact that we live in the South complicate the discussion? As the Georgia legislature prepares to grapple with campus carry, we dig into this issue of guns. And joining me to talk about it tonight, John Monroe, an attorney who has established a successful practice in the field of gun rights and Second Amendment issues. He's played a major role on behalf of the organization Georgia Carry in persuading legislators to expand the venues where guns can be legally carried. And Dr. Mark Rosenberg is the CEO of the Task Force for Global Health, one of the largest public health agencies in the United States. In the 1980s, as a high-level executive at the Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Rosenberg oversaw the establishment of a program to track statistics on gun violence. When his work ran afoul of pro-gun advocates, he was quietly fired. But he has maintained his involvement in promoting research on gun violence. And I want to start our discussion and certainly come back to your personal story, Mark, in just a moment. But first, today, down at the Capitol, Representative Rick Jaspers is currently working on gun rights legislation, specifically with regard to campus carry. He feels very strongly about who should decide whether guns should be allowed on campus. Let's listen to his site.
I think our Republicans in this room do not want to give college presidents the opportunity to choose. I think it's a hard decision that we don't want to give up. It is hard. And if we decide to do it, we'll do it. If we won't, we won't. But I think it's a decision the legislature needs to make, not a bureaucrat.
Interesting remarks, John. Let me turn to you for some reaction first. And I'm just curious to know, the campus carry provision, is it in or out?
In or out
of the legislation?
Oh, well, it's probably too soon to know since the bill hasn't been filed yet. But,
yeah. I just thought you might have some inside information on that.
No, I'm afraid not.
All right.
But I agree with Representative Jaspers because the legislature has a constitutional obligation to decide what's a crime in Georgia and what is not. That can't be delegated. It's unconstitutional for the legislature to say, for example, college presidents decide whether or not it's okay to carry guns on campuses. You can't do that.
So the opt-in provision is probably not going to fly. Opt out.
Well, I guess it would depend on how it's worded, of course, because you can have things like a licensing provision, which can be constitutional. But if you actually delegate the decision of what's a crime and what's not a crime to a bureaucrat, you can't do that.
Let me ask you, Georgia is primed, if they pass this legislation, to become one of the gun-friendliest states in the nation. Why the urgency on expanding gun laws in Georgia?
Well, it's not a matter of urgency. It's something that actually just a few years ago, at the time that Georgia Carry was founded, Georgia had more places off limits for carrying guns than any other state in the nation, including states like New York and California, for people with licenses. The ability to carry guns in Georgia was slowly taken away from people, as it were, and it's being slowly given back to them. It's not really a matter of urgency so much as the pendulum swinging back the other way, which in my view is the correct way.
Can let me bring you into this conversation here, and I want to get to your personal story, but you've studied gun statistics and violence now for years. Can legislation truly tackle the problem of gun violence or not effectively?
Oh, it can, but I don't think we've served our legislators well. I think a real question when a legislator has to decide on a particular piece of legislation is, what will the impact of this legislation be? And the truth is, we don't know whether carrying guns on college campuses will cause more people to be shot and die from firearm injuries, or whether it will protect people. We just don't know.
Why don't we know?
Because the research that studies the impact of laws like this was stopped. It was stopped by the NRA because there are a lot of people who feel that there should not be any discussion of firearm legislation allowed. There's a zero tolerance policy that was promoted in the 80s, and that said we won't even allow this subject to be brought up. We won't allow data to be collected. We won't allow the studies to be done. So as a result of that, none of us know what works and what doesn't work. Whether allowing more people to carry guns on the street will prevent crime or whether it will lead to more people dying. The very basic critical questions we can't yet answer.
John, what's wrong with knowing what the result of actions are?
I don't think there is anything wrong with knowing, and in fact, I think we do know. We can look at states, for example, like Alabama, right next door. It's not illegal to carry guns on college campuses there. California, Utah, it's not illegal to carry guns there. And a good case study is the state of Virginia. There's not a crime in Virginia against carrying guns on campuses, and there have been 2 incidents there that have made some headlines. The Virginia Tech one, which was quite a tragedy, and the Appalachian Law School, which you don't hear too much about, but there when a shooter started, 2 armed law students subdued him almost instantly, and it ended before it even started.
But would you, well, okay, there's a couple of things I want to come back to, but I want to throw some statistics up there that are kind of interesting that I'd like to have you comment on. I'm not putting these up there to sway the argument one way or the other. I just thought they were fascinating. The first one we have coming up is gun ownership rates worldwide, which is fascinating. No, we don't have that one? We don't have that one. All right, how about gun homicide rates? No? Do we have that one? No? Okay, we'll come back to those in just a minute. All right, here's homicide. The gun homicide rates in the industrialized world per 100,000 people. Mexico way up there, which there are problems, issues down there, of course, with drug cartels. The United States, 2.97. Behind us, interestingly enough, Liechtenstein and Switzerland and Belgium. Now, I know they're smaller, so there's less people in these countries and probably less guns. But even so, do you not find that to be an interesting statistic?
Well, actually, Switzerland is an interesting one because there's compulsory military service in Switzerland, and then when people are discharged, they take their weapons home with them. So gun ownership in Switzerland is nearly universal.
Mark, your thoughts on these kinds of statistics?
Well, I think you really need to gather statistics that answer the critical questions. And I would say there are 4 critical questions. The first is, what's the problem? How many people are shot? Under what circumstances? When does it happen? What's the relationship between them? What kind of firearms? But what's the problem?
Well, you know, we have answers to a lot of those questions. Sometimes it's a matter of public record, but we need to go back to your original story. Because when you were studying these statistics at the CDC, this is what you were compiling, correct?
This is what we were trying to look at. What's the problem? What are the causes? And most important, what works to prevent the deaths of children, of parents, of people in our community? What works? And we made some progress starting to look at the nature of the problem. For example, we found that most gun deaths are suicides. 2/3 of all gun deaths in this country are suicides, and people usually don't have any appreciation of that fact. We looked at the problem of what are the causes, and what we found is that if you have a firearm in your home, instead of protecting you, it increases the risk that someone in your home will die from homicide 300%. It increases the risk that someone in your home will die from suicide by 500%. And then we got to the question of what works to prevent these. And that's where our research was stopped. But we don't know the impact of carry laws.
And why do you think it was stopped? Why were you fired, do you think?
Well, I think the research was stopped because there were people who said, we don't want to allow any compilation of statistics. Any discussion of this has to be forbidden because it will result in having all of your guns taken away. The very term gun control, I wouldn't use gun control. That's not what we were after. But the question is, how do you prevent our children from being killed, or our parents or our siblings?
I think the claim, the claim by the NRA, John, you can weigh in on this, was though that the researchers, not necessarily you, but researchers doing this work, were biased, that they were going in with an agenda. They were going in with a conclusion and looking for statistics to support that.
Some research is biased, and it's really important that we do research that's unbiased. The other thing that I've come to understand is that when research is done, it has to have two objectives. The first is we want to save lives and reduce firearm injuries and deaths. The second and very important objective of the research has to be to protect the legitimate rights of legitimate gun owners. That has to be part of how you set your research up, because the Constitution in this country says that's a right. It's a constitutional right. So the research has to be designed to protect not only the people from being injured, but to protect the rights of people who legitimately own guns. It's very much like protecting someone who has cancer. You want something that's going to stop the tumor, but you also need something that's going to protect that person's life and their vital organs.
You know,
both.
Well, John, why wouldn't the NRA support research into these
well, I don't
things?
represent the NRA, so I don't know what.
But you can speak to their thought process, I think.
Well, if their position was that researchers were biased, I can certainly understand where that would be a concern. To me, research ought to be purely scientific. You're gathering information and trying to draw conclusions from it.
I'm sure you're both probably familiar with the editor, opinion writer at Guns and Ammo, who was recently fired for intimating that all Constitution. Now, this is a guy who's been writing about guns for 30 years, the most popular writer they've ever had, really, at Guns and Ammo. But he did intimate in a column that all constitutional rights have always been regulated and should be. And for that, he was fired. So my question is there no longer room for rational thought or compromise?
Well, there's always rational thought, and there's certainly always room for it. I'm not sure what you mean by compromise. Well,
when we're creating laws, for example, is there room for compromise? I mean, we know that those who are for gun rights are 100% for gun rights and don't want to give at all.
Well, if you're talking about a constitutional right, the Constitution imposes parameters around what the government can do. And, as long as the government operates within those parameters, it can do whatever it wants to do. If it operates outside those parameters, then the law is unconstitutional.
I think what's happened is that people have been so hardened into their positions that they lose sight of the other side. Mm-hmm. And I think it is so important that we come together and that we understand the other side's position. Where do they come from? There are people who own guns and use them for hunting and target shooting or self-defense, and they're a very important part of their life. There are a lot of people who don't understand that. And the only reason that we're so stuck is that people are case-hardened into opposite positions, and they lose sight of what the problem is.
Which brings us to the culture of guns, particularly in the South. Why do we love guns so much? Why do we love our guns in the South?
Well, I think that their patriotism runs deeply in the South. It runs strong. And believing in the Second Amendment and being self-sufficient, I think, are important principles in the South. Property ownership is important in the South. And gun ownership and use of guns is a natural corollary to those kinds of concepts.
And I think it's possible to protect our children and protect our communities and protect the rights of legitimate gun owners. I don't think they're in opposition. You can do both, but you have to set up your research and your data so that it aims to do both. It's possible. We can solve this.
Well, changing a culture would seem to be a lot harder than changing a law. So, I mean, where do you start?
I don't think you have to change the gun culture. There are lots of people who like to hunt. There are lots of people who like to target shoot. And there are lots of people who want guns for self-protection. You don't have to change that. But what you have to find out is, how do you protect someone with a serious mental illness and a history of violence from having unfettered access to tons of weapons and ammunition? How do you keep people who shouldn't have access to guns because they've been adjudicated mentally ill or they're a convicted felon? How do you keep them from getting access? You don't have to change the culture, and you don't have to take guns away from the people who legitimately have them.
Well, how do you take the emotion out of the debate? John?
I don't think you can. I mean, for some people it's an emotional matter, and you're not going to take the emotion away from them.
So is it your thought that we have enough gun laws on the books already and they just need to be enforced, or?
Well, I think we have way too many gun laws on the books, many of which are not enforced and many of which should not be enforced and shouldn't be on the books. My belief is a person who chooses to ought to be able to carry a gun wherever he wants to, short of places where guns just aren't allowed at all, like jails and prisons and places like that. But having locations where people aren't allowed to carry guns, but there's no substitute for that in terms of security, like college campuses or government buildings, I think that's just a recipe for disaster, and that's why we're having so many school shootings around the country.
And I guess I would start from a slightly different position. I would say, let's find out what's the effect of letting people carry guns in schools. Let's see what happens. What does it result in?
We've run out of time. Of course, we could keep going with this for quite a while, but thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you, Bob.
Appreciate it. Tomorrow, as the record-setting pace continues at the Capitol, we're going to recap the action so far and chart the course of what's to come. In the meantime, let us hear from you about tonight's show or anything you think should be on our radar. Follow us at Twitter at OTSGPB, OTS for On the Story. And be sure to sign up for our daily email blast at gpb.org. It covers everything you need to know about the legislature. Thanks for joining us for our coverage of Day 7 of the 2014 session. 33 days to go. I'm Bobby Batista for On the Story. Good night.
This is a GPB original production.